Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond. As always, I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And we are rapidly closing, I have to tell you, on almost 80 shows, which is quite an achievement if you think about how long a typical show lasts on conventional broadcasting. Well, as you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learn that raw sewage may now be poured into England's rivers and onto England's beaches with impunity, i.e. that having indulged in excesses in the past, the water companies can now feel relatively unconcerned about any future fines. This does not strike most people as a step forward in environmental terms, and one wonders what the COP26 delegates might make of this move. And of course, as I always say, don't forget that you and your family are paying for this pantomime. We ought to count our blessings that the water system in Scotland is handled differently. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight we are talking to scientific journalist and author Marcus Chown. We'll be discussing his views on the Tory government, what he thinks of Brexit, and perhaps Nicola Sturgeon, and why he thinks that independence for Scotland was probably a good idea. And we'll be talking about COP26, his latest book called Breakthough, and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. Details are on the What's On guide at whatson.scot. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talk, so in many respects, this is your show. And we're live, we're free, so no license, no problem. Get in touch with your questions and comments. We've already had one ahead of time, and thank you for that. Right, tonight, The Nation talks to Marcus Chown. How are you, Marcus? How has COVID affected you?
I'm very well, thank you. I work from home, so it hasn't really affected me. And my wife is an NHS nurse, so she'd gone into work. She went into work every day during the lockdown, so we were unaffected in that way. But I was been quite shocked in the last couple of days by two events. Last night I went to the Royal Institution in London to a lecture by Roger Penrose, who got the Nobel Prize for black holes last year. And I would say that more than 90% of the people were not wearing masks. And it was a very enclosed, stuffy place, and they were scientists. And last week, I went to the Affordable Art Fair in Battersea, which is in South London. And a lot of the people that go there are very well heeled. So I would imagine well educated. Once again, 90% with no masks. And I spoke to these people to come from Montreal to display their paintings. And this guy said, I'd just got on a London bus, and it completely freaked me out that hardly anyone was wearing a mask. So that's one of my observations over the last few days. At the time when we have more COVID cases than all the other European countries put together.
You need to spare a thought then for the poor folks who work in the House of Commons and the House of Lords at Westminster, where apparently it is a requirement if you're a member of staff to wear a mask, but not if you're an MP. And the rationale, which was provided by the government in the form of Rees-Mogg, is that we MPs don't need to wear masks because we all know each other.
Well, I mean, how ridiculous is that? If you've got COVID, you can still give it to someone, even if you know them. I mean, it's bizarre. And I completely agree with you. I feel sorry for the people that have to work there. And I noticed in the last week that at least one MP has come down with COVID. I would expect the majority of Conservative MPs to be self-isolating because they were all in the same enclosed space with him for many hours. Has that happened?
Well, who knows what's going to happen now. The secret, let me tell you what the answer to your predicament is. You need to move to Scotland. And I'll tell you why. Because the wearing of masks in Scotland is pretty much de rigueur. You can't go into a store or a shop. You can't board a bus, really, or board a train without the vast majority of people wearing masks. And that's essentially because I suspect the leadership makes it very plain that mask wearing is appropriate and fitting, and you owe that to your fellow citizens. And I think when you get advice that's couched in these terms, not in ambiguous, well, it's up to you, it depends how you feel, which side of the bed you got out of this morning. When you have it explained to you directly by authority figures, there tends to be a fairly large degree of compliance.
Yeah, and as you say, the messaging from Boris Johnson's government has been absolutely terrible. I mean, I look around on a bus, all the people, and I wonder, do they just not realise that COVID cases are rocketing at the moment? Or do they not care about me? Because principally, I'm protecting them by wearing a mask. And also, because a mask is a two-way barrier, I'm also protecting myself. But I do look around and I just wonder what information. I don't blame people, because I just think that maybe a lot of people have got a lot of misinformation. But I'm glad to hear. I should move to Scotland. In fact, a couple that I know did actually do that recently. They moved from London to Perthshire, and they're very, very happy.
Yes, well, Perthshire's a lovely part of the world, I have to say. But I'm a bit biased, I have to say also. Well, I'm glad they made the move, and I hope they're happy in doing so. I think they'll find that, or you'll find when you talk to them, that their experience of people around them wearing masks is very, very different, which I think is a helpful thing. And also, the biggest concern, I guess, in Scotland right now is the fact that loads of people will be coming in, maybe from countries where mask wearing isn't mandatory or appropriate, into an environment where everyone else is wearing masks. But you'd have to be very socially sort of inappropriate to walk into a shop or a store in Scotland not wearing a mask.
Yeah.
I want very much, before we get any further, to, if you don't mind, Marcus, to tackle the question that came in just as we were about to start, which was from Ashbury Stumble, who says, "Welcome, Marcus. Can you briefly explain, if the universe is expanding, what is it expanding into?"
Okay, well, it's not expanding into anything. So in 1915, November 1915, at the height of the First World War, Albert Einstein in Berlin came up with or presented his new theory of gravity. And basically what that actually tells us is that simply the separation of the galaxies. Okay, you didn't know about galaxies, but we know they're the building blocks of the universe. There are about 2 trillion of them. We live in one of them, in the Milky Way. All the theory tells you is that they should be separating as the universe expands. So it doesn't say anything about what they're expanding into. So it could very well be that the universe is infinite in extent. Okay, so it doesn't have an edge. It's just every galaxy is moving away from every other galaxy. It could be that the universe curves back on itself through a higher dimension, in the same way that the surface of a ball curves back on itself through the 3rd dimension. It could be something like that. So really, it's not expanding into anything, because the universe, by definition, is all there is. On the other hand, I can just tell you something else, and that is that we don't see all of the universe. So we only see a tiny portion of it. The reason for that is because of an amazing scientific fact. The universe was born. Okay, that's an incredible thing, that we know that the universe was born. So it hasn't existed forever, it was born. And it was born about 14 billion years ago. And what that means is that we can only see the light from the objects whose light has taken less than 14 billion years to get here. If there's an object and light would take 15 billion years to get here, its light still traveling towards us. It isn't here. So what we actually see is a kind of bubble of space. We call it the observable universe. Within that observable universe are about 2 trillion galaxies. We've counted them. And that bubble is surrounded by a horizon. We call it the light horizon, but it's exactly the same as the horizon at sea. So we know there's more of the ocean over the horizon. We know there's more of the universe over the horizon. Okay, so just simply more stars. So if we talk about the observable universe, then over the edge are simply more galaxies and stars. But if we're talking about the whole universe, there is no edge. Does that?
And when you say that, you're talking about the parts of the universe we can't see at all.
Absolutely. I mean, because So imagine that the universe is in some kind of like giant soap bubble, you know, and there's this membrane around it, like soap film. That's the horizon of the universe, right? As the universe grows older, more stuff comes over the horizon. So in other words, we're able to see objects further away because their light's not, you know, it takes longer to get to us. So as the universe grows older, we see more and more. This bubble expands out into what could be an infinite universe. We don't know. But actually, unfortunately, I've just told you something that's incorrect, because in 1998, we discovered, contrary to all expectations, that the universe's expansion is speeding up. So after the big, you know, there was the Big Bang, all the material in the universe began flying apart like bits of cosmic shrapnel. And we thought that the only force operating was gravity. And the gravity is kind of like a web of elastic connecting all the galaxies. So breaking that expansion. So we thought the expansion should be slowing up. In 1998, we discovered, incredibly, the expansion is speeding up. And that we think there's something called dark energy, which has got repulsive gravity that's doing that. And the guys who discovered that got the Nobel Prize. But what that actually means is that eventually the horizon will start shrinking again. And eventually we will be the only gay in the village. We'll be the only galaxy in the whole universe in about 100 billion years' time. If this dark energy continues to accelerate the expansion of the universe, we will be one galaxy in a completely empty universe.
And does that mean that we might see a reverse of the Big Bang, i.e. all reduces to one point, and then there's another Big Bang and it goes again?
Possibly. I mean, the problem at the moment is that this dark energy is the dominant component of the universe. I mean, how incredible that until 1998, we'd missed the major mass component of the universe. So it accounts for about 2/3 of the mass of the universe. It's got this stuff called repulsive gravity, okay? So it means that 2/3 of the stuff in the universe, it's invisible, by the way, it fills all the space, it's in the room where you are now, and it's got repulsive gravity, but it's only builds up enough repulsive gravity over cosmic sizes. That stuff is dominant component of the universe, and we don't know what it is, but it's speeding up the expansion of the universe. And it's looking likely that what will happen is that the galaxies will just be spread further and further apart and diluted until the universe becomes completely dark. So that the outcome you're talking about doesn't look likely. However, we don't know why this repulsion, this dark energy, switched on. We think it switched on about 8 to 10 billion years ago. We don't know why it switched on. We don't know anything about it. It's the biggest unsolved puzzle in cosmology. So it could be it'll switch off again. And if that actually happens, you're absolutely right. The universe could collapse back down to a big crunch, a kind of mirror image of the Big Bang.
Only for the whole thing to kick off all over.
Well, the thing is, there is a bit of a problem with that because it's called entropy. So basically, during the expansion phase, the stars give out light, and that actually increases the entropy, or what we call a disorder of the universe. So when you come down to a big crunch, you're not starting off exactly the same way as you were for the previous one. So what this means is if there was a series of Big Bangs, they would get smaller and smaller and smaller. So, you know, it wouldn't be like the universe would be pulsating like a giant beating heart, you know, throughout infinity. The truth is, we really don't know. I mean, these are the really big questions. But how amazing, isn't it incredibly amazing that we're at this point where I always think this is amazing, that previous generations would have killed to know what we know. So we can see the extent of the universe. In other words, we can see to the edge of the observable universe. We can count up its building blocks, which are about 2 trillion galaxies. Not only that, but we know that it all began in a hot dense phase of Big Bang 14 billion years ago, and out of the cooling debris of that expansion, they're called they're congealed the galaxies like our Milky Way. So this is a kind of a creation picture that is scientific. You know, previously we've had other theories, like, you know, the universe was on the back of a turtle and that was on the back of another turtle and all that kind of stuff. But now we actually have something scientific, which means we have something that is falsifiable. So, you know, you can do observations and prove that's wrong or it's right. And we can begin to answer or ask questions, really, really fundamental questions, and have some chance of answering them in the next few decades. Questions like, what was the Big Bang? You know, what drove the Big Bang? What happened before the Big Bang? You know, what is space? What is time? You know, these are questions that we can now begin to have a reasonable chance of answering in the next few decades. So it's a great time to be alive for science.
Let me ask you, this is very interesting. Let me ask you a little bit about your latest book, Breakthough. Oh, by the way, when people want to get a copy of Breakthough, what's the best way of doing it? Do they have to go to Amazon, or can they get your book?
Well, I would please Google it, and unfortunately Amazon doesn't pay any tax. So if you want to buy it from anywhere. Buy it from Blackwell, buy it from anywhere. But I would say avoid Amazon until it pays some tax. But yeah, you can get it from Blackwell's or Foyle's, or there are plenty of bookstores in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you, for the benefit of those watching and listening, let me give you a taster. You're going to love this. The book is about the most incredible processes that produced some of the major scientific advances that we know of today. Listen to this. I just love this. A physicist recovering from a hellish camping trip in the wettest location in the Highlands predicts the existence of an unsuspected subatomic particle, and half a century later, at a cost of 5 billion euros, the Higgs boson appears at the Large Hadron Collider. What a story. What actually happened? We have this physicist, I think we can guess his name now, but this is for real, is it? This is a real...
Yeah, and really my book is about this amazing magic at the centre of science, which people tend not to talk about. And that is the idea, and this is something completely new under the sun, that it's possible to write down a mathematical formula, you know, on a piece of paper, on a blackboard, on a whiteboard, as Peter Higgs did, and it can predict the existence of something nobody ever suspected. And then, you know, decades later, people go out and look for it and they find it. You know, this is magic. When it first happened, I mean, the first instance I write about in my book is the discovery of Neptune. Because when Uranus, or however you pronounce it, was discovered in 1783 by William Herschel, who was a German immigrant in Bath, it was soon discovered that it never followed its predicted orbit. It constantly wandered. And so it was suspected that there was another planet, even further from the sun, that was tugging on it with its gravity. And it was possible to deduce where that planet was, simply because Newton's law is a universal law of gravity. So that means that every chunk of matter pulls on every chunk of matter. You know, you have a gravitational pull between you and the coins in your pocket, you know, between you and the person waiting for a bus, only it's quite weak. So the Uranus was being pulled not only by the sun, it was being pulled by the Earth, by Jupiter, whatever, Saturn. So what you had to do, you had to subtract all those effects to be left with the pull that it was getting from this invisible object. And so two people, a Cornish autistic genius and a Frenchman, simultaneously predicted the existence of this planet, and there it was. And never in the history of the human race had this ever happened before. So Neptune was discovered basically by a man sitting at a desk with a quill pen. You know, I mean, Antarctica was discovered by people that went out in ships and actually found it. But now that science can do these amazing things. And as we were talking about Peter Higgs. Peter Higgs predicts the existence of a subatomic particle, the Higgs particle, that's found 40 years later at an incredible effort that involved tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of scientists, and 5 billion euros. So, and this has been repeated over and over. I mean, Paul Dirac, who was a very strange physicist, he was the Mr. Spock of physics, really. I can explain why if I have time, but he wrote down his thing, which we now call the Dirac equation. He was playing with mathematical formulae at Cambridge in 1928. I should tell you that the Dirac equation is one of only 2 equations engraved on the floor of Westminster Abbey. The other is the temperature of a black hole due to Stephen Hawking. And the Dirac equation was to describe an electron, which is a small particle that orbits in atoms, moving near the speed of light. So you needed to unite the two great developments of early 20th century physics, which was quantum theory, the theory of very small, and relativity, the theory of things moving near the speed of light. And to find this description of an electron moving near the speed of light, basically Dirac guessed the equation. And it worked perfectly, but there was a real problem. The machinery of his equation was duplicated, and he just couldn't understand it. In addition to an electron, which is a negatively charged particle, it predicted a positively charged particle, which we now call a positron. So this equation told us that there existed a whole universe of what we now call antimatter, so famous that the Starship Enterprise was, driven by antimatter. This is just incredible that we can just write these equations down and learn things about the universe. What it's telling us is that the real universe has a mathematical twin that mimics it in every conceivable way. And nobody knows why that's true. Nobody. And in fact, it is so amazingly ridiculous that the scientists themselves can barely believe it. So famously, Einstein he comes up with his law of gravity, his theory of gravity in 1915, and it predicts the existence of black holes and it predicts the Big Bang. But Einstein didn't believe either of those predictions ever in his life, because it's really hard to believe that those arcane, almost like hieroglyphs that you write on a piece of paper are really telling you something about the real world, So that's the kind of magic that I kind of highlight. And the Peter Higgs example is a really extreme example of that, because yes.
I'm going to give you another quote from the book, because you said that was an extreme example, but this sounds pretty amazing to me too. You say, a soldier dying of an agonizing skin disease in a World War I field hospital predicts the existence of a nightmare astronomical object. And 55 years later, it's discovered by a man who celebrates by buying his children Knickerbocker glories at a Hastings beachfront cafe. Explain.
Yeah, I really love that comparison, the difference. Karl Schwarzschild was 40 and he was on the German side in the First World War. There was no need for him to volunteer, but he was Jewish. And anti-Semitism was on the rise in Germany, and he wanted to show that he was as good as any other German. And he ended up at a weather station, and he calculating shell trajectories. And then in the winter of 1915, he suddenly got these blisters on the inside of his mouth, and eventually, they spread all over his whole body. Weeping, bloody blisters. He would end up in a field hospital on the Eastern Front. And it took ages before they realized he had a disease called pemphigus vulgaris, which is a disease in which the immune system attacks your skin. Well, that's pretty serious, because your skin obviously is a barrier against bacteria and all kinds of things, pathogens. But anyway, he'd been in Berlin as an astronomer before he volunteered, and he knew that Einstein, also in Berlin, was developing this new theory of gravity. And in his bed, listening to the distant thunder of the guns, he managed to get a copy of Einstein's talks, his papers. And he devoured this new theory of gravity, which basically said that mass or energy curves space. Okay, so we can't see it, and bodies react to that. So rather than there being a force between the Earth and the Sun, like a bit of invisible elastic, what the Sun does is it creates a valley in the space-time around it. We can't see it because it's a four-dimensional thing. And the Earth goes around the rim of this valley, rather like a roulette ball in a roulette wheel. So anyway, he tried to work out what is the space-time curvature for a compact body like a star, and he sent the paper to Einstein in Berlin. Einstein was amazed to get this letter from somebody on the Eastern Front, and even more amazed because his theory was very complicated. Instead of one equation, which Newton had, Einstein had 10. So getting an exact solution, that is, working out the exact curvature of space for any given mass, was very difficult. Einstein thought it was impossible. And here is this man, he found out how to do it. And Einstein, presented this work in Berlin. But Schwarzschild, who was dying, hadn't finished. He realized that if the mass was compressed very much, the curvature, the valley of space-time would become deeper and deeper and deeper until it would become a bottomless pit from which nothing could escape, light, matter, nothing. And of course, the word to describe that would not be coined for more than half a century, but we all know that word because the word is black hole. And then if you fast forward to 1971, the contrast is amazing. Schwarzschild unfortunately died in Berlin in May 1916, and he was he was 40 odd. But then you fast forward to Herstmonceux Castle, which is this 15th century castle surrounded by a moat in East Sussex, which of course was where the Royal Greenwich Observatory was, and a guy called Paul Murdin and Louise Webster. Now, Louise Webster is a woman whose name you do not know, that nobody knows. They gave the Nobel Prize last year for black holes, but they didn't ever mention Louise Webster or Paul Murdin. They discovered black holes. So they found a star, which was a really big, massive star, and it was whirling around absolutely nothing. There was just nothing there, And because of how fast it was whirling around, they could calculate the mass of the invisible object. And it was something at least 4 to 6 times the mass of the sun. And that could only be a black hole. And as you rightly said, Paul Murdin then celebrated with his boys, so I think they were 5 and 6, in a Hastings beachfront cafe with Knickerbocker glories. And presumably, the boys thought maybe Dad will find some more black holes and we'll get some more Knickerbocker glories. So, but anyway, so oddly enough, I went to that talk by Roger Penrose last night. He got the Nobel Prize for black holes. But once again, the people who discovered it have been overlooked. I mean, the famous case is Jocelyn Bell, who is from Northern Ireland and discovered pulsars, pulsating neutron stars, in 1967 at Cambridge. There have now been 3 Nobel Prizes for pulsars, and none have gone to her. So I don't know. It's a weird system, isn't it? Really.
Sounds a bit chauvinist somehow.
Yeah, it does. It does. And Louise Webster, sadly, she was Australian. She went back to Australia. She had liver disease, and she was the first Australian to ever have a liver transplant. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 49, and she's been written out of the history of science. So when I was tweeting about my book the other day, someone said, "Well, are there any women in your book?" And I thought, well, not many, no, but there is Louise Webster, and she really deserves to be remembered. She really does. I could go on about others that I think have been overlooked as well.
I think you could go a little bit longer and tell us about Faraday, because and the connection between him and James Clerk Maxwell, because I think that's also a fascinating story.
I'm totally fascinated by Faraday because I live within maybe half a mile of the bookbinders where he was apprenticed when he was 14. And Faraday was uneducated, he was self-taught. And he got the equivalent of the golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because at this bookbinders, it was a Huguenot refugee who owned it, and he used to encourage Faraday to read the books he was binding, many of which were scientific. Then one day someone came in for a book they were having bound, and they had tickets for lectures at the Royal Institution in London, which is off of Piccadilly, by Humphrey Davy. Now, Humphrey Davy was a scientific superstar. He was so famous that during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon actually gave him an award, even though he was English. And he, obviously the miner's safety lamp, he discovered chemical elements. Anyway, Faraday went along and was fascinated and made very wonderful, really, really fantastic notes, which he illustrated. He sent them to Davy, but Davy was impressed, but said he didn't have a job. And it looked as if Faraday was going to spend his life bookbinding. But then I think it was a few years later, Humphrey Davy's bottle washer was caught fighting, and he fired him. And he sent a note to Faraday and said, "Do you want to work with me?" And it turned out that Faraday really was Humphrey Davy's greatest discovery, because they worked together on electricity, which was like, the absolute frontier of science. Mary Shelley had written Frankenstein about energizing dead matter, by electricity. It was thought to be satanic. Anyway, as it turned out that Faraday then invents the electric motor. So, in about 1821, there's an electric motor spinning in the basement of the Royal Institution while carts, horse-drawn carts are clattering past on the cobbles. I mean, a piece of the future had just fallen into London. Then he creates a dynamo. He generates electricity from magnetism, which is how we do it today. So basically, he created our entire electrical power system. But the point is, in the connection with Maxwell, is that Faraday was humiliated by the scientists, the educated scientists, Cambridge and Oxford educated scientists of his day, for not having any mathematical background. But Faraday was very visual, and he knew when he put two magnets together, there was definitely something in the air between them, and he came up with the idea of the magnetic field. There's a force field. There's something actually in the space, and this made him do experiments that no one else would do. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he got a letter from James Clerk Maxwell in Scotland, and it said, "I think you're right." And Faraday was a very emotional man, and he was brought to tears by the fact, because he knew that Maxwell was a great physicist, and Maxwell actually thought that he was right. And then Maxwell then needed to turn this visual theory into mathematics, and that's what he did. So he started off by, he knew that there had to be something in the air between a magnet and maybe a piece of metal. So he imagined that the air was filled with invisible toothed cogs. So, the magnet would turn a cog, which would turn another cog, and eventually that would apply the force. And he kept fiddling with this model, and he kept, he had to make the cog springy, and he had to do other things. And in the end, he just gave up, and he realized that the only description of an electric or magnetic field was mathematical. So this was a seismic shift in physics. He was the first physicist to realize that the real world, the fundamental world, was nothing like the world of our everyday experience. It could only be expressed in mathematics. I mean, that's not surprising. I mean, we evolved on an African plain, to spot a saber-toothed tiger a few hundred meters away. We did not evolve to see atoms or anything like that. So it's not surprising that the fundamental world is different. But Maxwell was the first person to realize this. But anyway, he noticed in these equations, which described electricity and magnetism, they're called Maxwell's equations, and people wear them on their T-shirts. He noticed that you could have a ripple through the electromagnetic fields that filled empty space, and he could see what the speed of that ripple was. It depended on two numbers. Now, at the time, Maxwell was at King's College in London, but he was on his holiday near Dumfries. It was Glenlair near Dumfries, where the family home was. And he knew that these two numbers he needed were in the library at King's College. So eventually, after his summer holiday, he came down on the train with his wife. She brought a pony with her, a horse with her, because they used to ride in Hyde Park in London. And he rushed into King's College, got the library book, put the two numbers in, and discovered that the speed of a ripple through the electromagnetic field was the speed of light. And he was the first person to realize there was a connection between light, electricity, and magnetism. And when he walked out onto the Strand, I'm imagining this, by the way, there would have been costermongers and carts going past, and he was the only person in the world who knew this. And he knew something else. He knew that the equations did not put any constraint on how fast or how slowly the electromagnetic wave oscillated. So he guessed that maybe red light was a slow oscillation and that blue light was maybe a bit faster, but he realized that there could be waves, electromagnetic waves, which was, were waving more sluggishly than red light or faster than blue light. In other words, there were millions of colors which were invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, Maxwell died at 48 of the same cancer that his mother died of at exactly the same age. And it was left to a guy about 20 years later called Heinrich Hertz, who was able to generate Maxwell's electromagnetic waves. Basically, he had a spark which created these waves, radio waves we call them now. They went at 1.5 meters across his desk, And he picked them up with a receiver. And when asked, what's the use of this, Heinrich Hertz said, no use whatsoever. He virtually invented the ultra-connected world of the 21st century that we live in, and he didn't think it was. Anyway. So Maxwell, the incredible Maxwell, when he was at school in Edinburgh, his fellow students at his school called him Dafty. And that was because his mother had died, his father had brought him up and had dressed him in kind of country clothes. And when he came to sophisticated Edinburgh, the other children made fun of him. But of course, they got egg on their face because Maxwell is generally believed to be the most important physicist between the time of Newton and Einstein.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating stuff. Thank you for that, Marcus. Now I want to take us from the sublime to the more than faintly ridiculous. Let's talk about politics. What's your opinion of the present Westminster government and the job that they're doing? And how do you feel about Brexit and the way the health service is being treated?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have an appalling government. I mean, I'm sure most people in Scotland realise that. We certainly realise it in England. And if we could get away from them, like you're thinking of getting away from them, we certainly would. And Brexit obviously is a complete disaster. I mean, at the time of the referendum, I tweeted that they wanted, they basically want to remove all controls on pollution or, worker standards, all these kind of things, so that the rich can make money easier. And literally, what has actually happened? Of course, that was Project Fear. Now we've got sewage in our rivers. We've got HGV drivers that we're removing all the safety standards so they can drive longer, all those kind of things. And of course, the main reason was to avoid the EU anti-tax avoidance legislation. But, and in 2015, the EU was the 10th most important topic for voters. But we had a conservative government that did terrible things over, austerity, for instance, which has put lots of people into poverty or whatever, and we're controlled a lot of the media, and therefore were able to put the blame on the EU, and people believed it. They were lied to, unfortunately. So it is a really a sad thing that's actually happened. And they're still getting away with the lies. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, one of the things I do worry, I'm a journalist, and one of the things I would say is the minimal thing we should expect from journalists, the absolute minimal thing, is that they actually remind the politicians of what they said last year. That's the minimal thing. It's the thing that, led by donkeys, you might have seen, they do it. It doesn't happen, because they all said that there would be lower prices in the shops, that we'd have better, Gove said we would have better environmental standards. None of these things have come to pass. And they just need to be constantly, but I look at our media and the politicians are not reminded of all these things that they said, So obviously Scotland is sensible because they voted against Brexit. But there we are. Yeah. And the NHS, that's a very, very close to my heart, because really, if you had two things, if you had 6 letters to encapsulate Britain, they would be BBC and I would say the NHS. I lived in America. I remember when I broke my finger, no one would treat me until I actually signed all these insurance documents with my broken finger, and then they still missed the fact that it was broken. I do realise we are very fortunate to have the NHS, but it has been chronically underfunded by the Conservative government. To give you some idea, health service inflation runs at about 4%, right? And the reason for that, there's a lot of factors. One of them is the population is growing. So there's more people. People are living longer. The increase in population gives you about 0.5%. There's another 0.5% for the fact that people are living longer. So there's more people, and then those people are because they're living longer, are older and iller. Then there's the pharmaceuticals that go up. You add all these things together, and it's about 4%. So you actually have to increase the NHS budget by about 4% a year to stay where you are. Consistently over the last decade, the the increases have been 1% or less. So every single year, the NHS has been asked to do more with less money. So we've just seen it, so that it fails, so that people get angry. The classic way that you privatise, you destroy something. Before the Conservatives came to the power, and you can Google this if you don't believe me, the NHS was rated the #1 health service in the world, the most cost-effective, efficient and fairest health system. Those 3 words, it was the fairest, most cost-effective and efficient health service in the world. That was in about 2010. Google it, you'll find that there's the international comparisons show that. Now it's completely on its knees. Now I've seen pictures in the last few days of 27 ambulances stacked up outside an A&E. People are actually dying in ambulances before they get to the hospital because of the chronic underfunding. So as I say, it's a shocking thing that's actually happened. And at the moment, there is a healthcare bill that is being pushed through during a pandemic when the doctors and nurses are so exhausted, they can't really notice it, which will deeply, deeply damage the NHS. And it's been rubber stamped because the Tories have a very large majority. It's gone to the House of Lords. There may be some amendments, but really, generally, this legislation doesn't change. But what it does do is it allows a lot of bad things that happened during the pandemic to be baked in. So it allows private companies to sit on the board, NHS board, to commission services, so they can obviously commission from themselves. It allows services to be given to people or companies without any competition. So that we saw this during the pandemic, with there being a VIP lane for the government's friends, who basically got all the contracts without any competition. So there's a lot of this that's going on, and it's completely invisible. I mean, I wrote a 10-point summary of this bill, which I sent to every Lord whose email address I could find. I think I had replies from about 4. But again, this is this. Why would you want a major reorganisation of the NHS in the midst of a pandemic? I mean, why? I mean, it just seems completely, utterly stupid. Unless you think the shock doctrine, this idea. Naomi Klein wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine. You can push through the things that you want when people are distracted, when there's other things going on. So I see all this firsthand because my wife is an NHS nurse, and increasingly the service is privatised. Obviously not in Scotland, because Scotland is sensible. And things that would have been simple to do when it was a joined up service are very hard. So for instance, to get something like a wheelchair, can take you many hours, and you've got to negotiate with lots of people, when in fact these things all, they existed within a joined up NHS. And the understaffing, so the underfunding of the NHS has really caused understaffing, because the main cost of the NHS is people. So something like the NHS is short 43,000 nurses and about 10,000 doctors. This was before the pandemic. And we have the lowest number of beds per 100,000 by a large factor than any other European country. So we were in a crisis before the pandemic, and now obviously it's been exacerbated. Anyway, I can hear myself banging on about this. So
I would like you to bang on a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind, because I mean, most of what you said will resonate with the people watching and listening tonight. But what confuses them, and I suspect might also confuse you a little, is that when one looks at polling intentions across England, less so Wales perhaps, and certainly not Scotland, which is separate sort of arrangements. But the Conservatives seem to be running ahead in the polls. So here is a government which has brought the NHS to its knees, as you say, which has involved itself in numerous schemes to enrich their friends. They've done it openly. They've prorogued Parliament in the teeth of court judgments from north and south of the border, and yet they're ahead in the opinion polls. Why should that be, do you think?
Well, that is a complete mystery to me as well. Very, very hard to believe. I mean, and also something that I'd like an explanation from many people within the Labour Party, because I do remember many people in the Labour Party saying things like, if Jeremy Corbyn was not the leader of the Labour Party, we'd be 10 to 15 points ahead. I can't remember who said that, but prominent people in the Labour Party did say that. Well, we have another leader. And as you just rightly say, Labour are lucky to be neck and neck, during this crisis. It's very, very hard to believe. As far as the NHS is concerned, the government are very clever. They break the system, and what people see are the fact that they can't get doctor appointments, or they wait a long time at A&E or something, and they get angry at the staff. They don't realise that the staff are working their guts out to try and create a service. A classic example of this, it is so frustrating. I am yet to hear the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 or any of the media call the test and trace system anything but the NHS test and trace system. Okay, well, it's actually a consortium of failed private companies, G4S, Serco. I mean, there's a whole load of them that are involved. And yet it's labelled the NHS because it failed. It failed to provide a test and trace. And yet, if you listen to talk by all those media of the vaccine programme, which is very successful, they do not use NHS in front of it. And yet it was. So you can see that there was a clever, I mean, they are really clever in undermining the NHS and undermining people's faith in the NHS. But back to your question, why are people voting for them? I often ask this on Twitter, because I'm a bit of a Twitter addict, and I'd often ask people, and people do come back and they say, well, the opposition's a bit rubbish. And I think, well, yes, but they're not as bad as the Tories. I mean, the Tories, for instance, most people do not realise that they've borrowed far, far more than Labour governments since the Second World War, far more. And yet they are always promoting themselves as the prudent party, Anyway, so they've managed to tell people the opposite of what they are, and that Labour is a spending party. But if you don't like Labour, and at the moment I'm not really very happy with them at all, but I would always vote. I would vote for them because, if you say I don't quite like Labour, I can't vote for them. It's rather like saying I don't like this burger over here. I think I'll eat this toxic waste tip over here. Johnson's is such a toxic government, such an incompetent, malicious government that has done such long-term damage to the UK. England, Scotland, the whole lot. And yet I can't vote for anyone else. It is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. I mean, if the Conservatives just have to lie, because obviously if you exist to defend the interests of a small portion of society, and they do, obviously the more wealthy, then you have to persuade a lot of people who are not wealthy to vote against their interests, and they are. So it's fundamental to the way they behave that they have to lie, and they've been very, very successful at it. I mean, mainly I suppose because they do control a lot of the media, or certainly the media. If they don't control the media, a lot of the media obviously have an interest in the Conservatives being in power. You know, obviously the billionaires who own them pay less tax, I suppose. You know, so yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. I keep wondering, what is the thing that will tip people over? You know, could it be the sewage thing? Could it be the fact that the huge majority of Conservative MPs voted against an amendment which would stop raw sewage being pumped into our rivers by private companies without, and they would be able to do that without any financial penalty? Is that enough? Is that the thing? You know, the big problem is that you see this in the media or on social media only for about maybe a day or two. I think one of the great triumphs of Boris Johnson is that he's able to create a tsunami of disasters. You know, the disasters come so thick and fast that you haven't really had time to even consider the last disaster before the new one comes. And I think this is a policy to do this, you know, to have people angry about this, but something else and something else and something else and something else, and until people just put their head in their hands and they can't take it any longer. He certainly has done that in his political, a lot of his life. I mean, he's been fired from jobs. He tends to sort of things, you know, he's the kind of person the building collapses when he leaves it, you know. But having said that, people look at him and they think he's a laugh, you know, they think he's amiable Boris Johnson, you know. I mean, he's a mascot. I mean, my father-in-law reads the Times, believes everything in the Times, you know. If it's not in the Times, it doesn't happen. But he says, well, you know, Boris Johnson is on the front of the Times every day. He's eating an ice cream, you know, he's got a hard hat on, he's digging with a shovel. He gets sent round as a mascot so that people think, oh, things can't be that bad because, you know, laughing, joking Boris Johnson's around. So I don't know. John, do you have an answer, John?
Well, I'd like to offer a small crumb of comfort. In a past life, I set up the UK's first business ethics consultancy, if that's not an oxymoron. And I advised corporations across the world on business conduct and what they needed to do to reform their systems. Now, of course, most of the people who consulted with us were people who wanted to change anyway. And therefore, we were pushing against an open door. I accept that. But nonetheless, it was a very rewarding experience because I got to work with the chief executives, chairmen, there was mostly men at that time, and we're talking about 20 odd years ago, and boards right across the world. There's a whole series of issues that struck me that fall out of every single organizational predicament. And one of them, I won't mention it, one of them is that poor ethical standards precede corporate tragedy. If you look at the way corporations have collapsed, sometimes almost overnight, and I'm sure you can think of many here that were once household names that are no longer with us. And a lot of those collapsed because of bad behavior that was condoned. But there comes a point where ethical standards drop so far that the very fabric of the entity, it has become in some odd way completely ossified, and it can't respond because the corruption, because as you know, a fish rots from the head down, the corruption becomes so endemic that the whole entity goes into sort of a form of paralysis. And in business, you need to be able to adapt and move and change and modify. And that goes, it just disappears. And it seems to me, perhaps there's a parallel here with governments, i.e. that they too become ossified over time to such a degree that even though their PR systems might be just as good, if not better than anyone else's, people soon see that the entity has become hollowed out, if I can mix my metaphors, and it just collapses. I'm thinking in political terms about the Soviet Union and the Baltic states, for example, as one instance. But there are many, many others where there's a read across from organizations which are corporate business organizations into the political field as well.
You used an interesting word there, which is the word corrupt. And I would challenge anyone to hear that word on any news broadcast in Britain said about a politician. Okay, now what we're seeing with Boris Johnson's government is naked corruption. Naked corruption. You know, they basically used the pandemic as an opportunity to shift billions and billions, tens of billions of pounds of public money into their pockets and the pockets of their friends. This is corruption. Yet you never hear this word. Okay, so one of the problems is the media. I'm a journalist, and I think as a journalist you need to actually say what is. But for some reason we're not saying what is. A few years ago, I was leafleting outside St Thomas's Hospital in London on the River Thames, and it's opposite Westminster. And I was talking to this Nigerian nurse, and she said the difference between my country and your country is that we know our politicians are corrupt, you know, and we are seeing. But you would see our media talk about the corruption of an African country, or I don't know, or Putin or something like that. But the words which are needed to describe what we're seeing are not being used. And so what we're doing is we're normalizing this behavior. What we're seeing with this government is unprecedented. It's so unprecedented that many of the prominent conservative figures of the past, like Heseltine, Anna Soubry, they have disassociated themselves with it. You know, they've actually been cast out of the party because they didn't support Brexit, you know. So it's not simply that it's the other political parties or people with other political views that think this is out of the ordinary. It's actually members of the Conservative Party themselves, you know.
Well, I think, sorry, we're almost running out of time, Marcus, but I think the larger point about corruption also applies to the media. I think once you drop your standards and you become unethical, then customers make a choice if there's other choice available to them. And you've only got to look at the viewing figures to see that that's happening. I mean, in Scotland, it's chronic. I mean, the BBC is just falling off a cliff in terms of credibility, if not in precise viewing figures. I just want to remind everyone before we go, because I feel it's important that I didn't say this earlier. This is your quote about Scotland. I just want to remind people. You say, I don't want Scotland to see Scotland go. However, if I was Scottish, I could dump Johnson and this appalling Conservative government, undo Brexit, and not have the NHS sold to Trump, not suffer worsened food pollution and animal welfare standards, get rid of unelected Cummings. I would do it.
Well,
I just want
absolutely. I'd be quite sad about Scotland, but of course it's up to the Scottish people. But yeah, if I was Scottish, I think I'd be voting for independence.
Well, you said some of your friends have moved to Scotland. I'm sure you'd be very welcome.
Yeah, they have. I mean, the friend I'm thinking about, his wife had Scottish relatives anyway. But yeah, I think he's been very happy in Scotland. The only thing is, of course, it's quite cold. You know, when I go to Edinburgh, I think people are very hardy compared to in the south.
Yeah. Billy Connolly says that there's no really bad weather in Scotland, just the wrong clothes.
Yes. Yeah. No, that thing about I want to say that thing about the BBC is the BBC is incredibly important to us. It's really, really important that it's functioning. You know, it does do things which I don't really like. So, for instance, it gave a platform to Nigel Farage on I think about 25 occasions on Question Time. And I saw some research from, I think it was the University of East Anglia, that showed that the rise of UKIP came after those appearances. So what they were not reflecting the way people thought. Someone obviously booked him a lot, but we really do need the BBC, and we need it to be functioning, and we need it to be not interfered with by politicians, because without the BBC we would living in America, and if you live in America you've got no idea what's going on, you know. So it's a very valuable thing, you know, but it isn't properly functioning at the moment. You're stuck between a rock and hard place, trying, you know, you want it to respond to criticism, but you want it to stay, you know, because it's a very valuable thing.
The governance system is obviously inappropriate for the 21st century, where you have the government appointing conservative members to the head positions, and the notion that people who've given money to the conservative government are now acting impartially strains credibility. But that's what the BBC want us to believe. That's a big ask. And oh, by the way, I need to add that Kevin has just pointed out that we're streaming your website address as we speak. So people who want to plug into what you're doing, Marcus, can do that. They can see it on the screen as we speak. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I did say it would go fast. It's gone even faster than I expected. It's been very educational. And judging by the questions, which you have mostly anticipated, by the way, in talking about redshift and blue shift for the benefit of Mark and others who asked about the Tory party lead and stuff like that. So I think you would address most, if not many of those. And thank you to everyone for the questions. And a big thank you to you, Marcus. If you could stay on the line for a little bit after we're through, that would be very helpful, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, thanks, John. I've really enjoyed it.
Let me just make a few concluding remarks. A big thank you, as I said, to Marcus, and a big thank you to all of you for watching. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. This is the place, as you've seen tonight, for the big hitters, the people who actually know what they're talking about and can articulate it in terms that most people can access. We're back next week at the same time with another special guest. COP26 activist Graham Eddles is here next week, and he'll be taking your questions on COP, if you'd like to enter those on the website as you see it. As always, please look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National this week. You'll find it in the 7 Days Supplement, and I'll be dealing with ethics and morality and the lack of those in public life in the UK right now, and what I think the consequences, which we covered briefly with Marcus, might well be in the future, if not the very near future. Thanks again, and a good night to all of you. Join us next Wednesday, and remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. To all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, take care. See you next week.